Hello and most welcome to 1568. Yes, it's 1568 and nothing else. I accidentally indicated another number, but it is 1568 and nothing else. We will continue with Life Death by Jacques Derrida. We are in the fourth session, the logic of the supplement. We are currently at page 87. We ended quite a bit down on that page. So, little retake of what we mentioned last time. It was very interesting. We talked about how science has two sides, one rigid one and one flexible, contingent, not as fixed, the mother side, whereas the rigid has been called the father side earlier on here. We also saw, now we're talking mostly about Jacques, but he has the tendency to allow teleology in the text and essence and other metaphysical / religious concepts, which he then puts, well, in the example, he put it into citation marks, quotation marks, and sort of to ignore it and still being able to use it. Derrida is not accusing Jacob Bernard Canguilhem of hypocrisy or anything of that sort. This is the current tendency. He could have used almost anyone. But since Jacob is very eloquent, is a good read, he makes for an excellent choice. He expresses all things clearly. We can just quote him directly. And he depicts the modern metaphysical project of preserving determinism, object, the sense that everything is simply out there by itself, and those important features, that there is no telos, there is no purpose. And we have this excellent quote from Jacob himself, that reproduction is its own purpose. It's so beautiful. I almost want to cry. I'm not being ironical now. It's just fantastic. And it parallels so nicely with physics, where we have the exact same thing. Let me just rephrase it once more for the sake of it. Once the long period of incubation is over, the system becomes established by the repetition of identical events. the first step is taken once and for all. In such a system, however, reproduction, which is the very cause of existence, also becomes its purpose. It is doomed to reproduce itself or disappear. Physics, we have Big Bang and must be eternal classical laws, unchangeable. Once established, once the incubation of Big Bang is established, is gone, and establishment is there, it will not change, it cannot change, it dare not change. And here we have another beautiful one, that causality is inbuilt in a very sneaky way, so to speak. No accusation here. And Jacob himself says the reproduction that constitutes the very cause, the aita of existence, becomes in turn the end. Modern thinking. But the question is, to cut it short, shorter than Derrida ever would, is it sound? Well, it has a lot of problems. But that will be clear as we read on. Maybe I should just mention how energy comes into this place. How energy is freed and it's bound. So thermodynamic is a popular additive to this. Well, let's get on with it. We are, let's see, 10 lines from the bottom of page 87. Just after the parenthesis contains the German phrase jenseits. And beginning with in other words. In other words, not only does Jacob not break purely and simply with a philosophical discourse on essence, but he ends up returning with this essence of life as tendency, and capacity for reproduction, not only, and I would say, to essence, but also the essentiality of essence. The origin and end of essence as a dynamics and energy of being. That which gives the power and actuality of being. Maximal being, which assures from the inside, and that is the essence of essence, namely to have one's principle of being in oneself and not in some accident coming from outside, assures from the inside its own production. That is its reproduction. From this point of view, it is not just difficult to claim that for Jacob there is no essence of life. Indeed, quite to the contrary, he seems to be saying in a traditional way that life is the essence. The capacity to produce, reproduce oneself from the inside. That it is, in this sense, more essentially than the non-living that integrates into it, into its living being. If life had no essence, that would be because it is the essentiality of essence, being more essence than the rest. And this more brings in, as we saw earlier, the value of the maximum. It links these claims to the very classical discourse on essence, the one that in Aristotle relates dynamis to energia, or that of Spinoza's conatus, or Leibniz's appetitus. But it is obviously Hegel's discourse insofar as it develops the whole logic of essence based on the value of life. that here seems the closest. And especially, it is the economic dimension of this energetics that is going to bring this discourse into proximity to Nietzsche's discourse insofar as it associates reproduction with selection. Time and again, Jacob shows how the logic of the living as the logic of reproduction precisely is by this very fact selective. A logic of selectivity. Jacob writes, the very concept of selection is inherent in the nature of living beings, in the fact that they exist only to the extent they reproduce themselves. Each new individual, which by mutation, recombination and addition becomes the carrier of a new program, is immediately put to the test of reproduction. If this organism is unable to reproduce itself, it disappears. If it is able to reproduce itself better, faster than its congeners, this advantage, however minor, immediately favors its multiplication and hence the propagation of this particular program. If in the long run the nucleic acid text seems to be molded by the environment, if the lessons of past experience are eventually written into it, this occurs in a roundabout way through success in reproduction. But only what exists reproduces itself. Selection operates not on possible living organisms, but existent ones. That there is no reproduction without selection, or selection without reproduction, does not mean that these two forces cooperate peacefully. On the contrary, the relation can only be one of tension and contradiction, with effects of compromise. The deviation, écart of a mutation, can be reproduced and so not remain unique and thus ephemeral. only to the extent that it limits itself and conforms to certain conditions of reproduction, of reproducibility. An absolute deviation, an absolute monstrosity. Does not even relate enough to itself to reproduce itself, to divide itself and resemble itself in another copy of itself. The relation to self of self-reproduction is the general form of what comes to limit the deviation or the mutant by giving it at the same time the chance for reproduction. Whence a strategy and endless compromises in the logic of the living, in its tendency to integrate the novelty of programs. A novelty that must be new enough, disseminating enough to ensure maximal propagation and reproduction. But close enough to itself and repetitive enough to ensure that the dissemination is not a pure dissemination. That is a loss without return in the unique. Later, we will come across this same economy of dissemination in relation to viruses. For the moment, I'm attempting to clarify the relationship of the geneticists or modern biologists, scientists, discourse to the philosophical tradition. Debt and unrecognized dependence, denegation, simplification, caricature, submission to the constraints of a code, of a program, precisely of a calculating machinery from which he believes himself to be free. Even while he is reproducing its functioning, etc. In referring very rapidly and one right after another to Aristotle, Leibniz, Spinoza, Hegel, and Nietzsche, it was not my intention to conflate all these systems and make of them some confused amalgam. But simply to note very quickly that the discourse of modern genetics was making less of a break with these classical philosophemes than it appeared or than was claimed. And that not confronting them head on was not only not justified, but actually risked making one blind to the repetition of a very powerful code, itself the effect at some level of the logic of the living. Another example we could have taken, besides that of essence, is the example of truth. In one of those statements that almost sounds like an advertising slogan for theory from the 60s. It is true that there are fewer of these in Jacob than in Monod, this latter being at once less discreet and less advanced from this point of view. This latter, in one of these slogans, then Jacob writes, still under the rubric of the program, biology is no longer seeking for truth. It is building its own truth. Like the other natural sciences, biology today has lost many of its illusions. It is no longer seeking for truth. It is building its own truth. The implication here is that one inasmuch as truth is no longer being sought. This value has been discarded and suspicion cast upon all those who once believed that truth was this exalted thing. After which one ran, or before which one bowed down. While this caricature is acknowledged to be a simplification, what we just read with regard to essence, with regard to the history of the integron, and so on, should be enough to convince us that biology still seeks the truth of life and as life, as livingness in the reproducibility of the self. As for the formulation, it is building its own truth. This implies too that truth can be appropriated, which is not new, and that it is specific in its model to each field. But we have never had more reason to doubt this specificity than after reading and even approving Jacob. Who insists on the necessary and integrative cooperation between biology and the other natural sciences. On the fact that I quote, it's a quote from Jacob, contrary to what is often imagined, biology is not a unified science. The heterogeneity of its objects, the variety of its techniques, and the divergent interests of its practitioners all lead to a multiplication of disciplines. Of course, one would be able to respond that the appeal, which is indispensable, as we saw, to the physico-chemical sciences is not necessarily in contradiction with the specificity of biology. As Jacob recalls in this regard, this does not at all mean that biology has become an annex of physics. That it represents, as it were, a junior branch concerned with complex systems. And indeed, the value of complexity is not the only thing that distinguishes biology from physics. What also comes into play here is a new structure of the field of objectivity. But secondly, even if in what Jacob still calls the natural sciences, even if then in what Jacob still calls the natural sciences, among which he still locates biology, this latter had a specificity and its truth. One wonders how, once one has recognized the text, programming, information, the factory, and so on, as concrete models of the logic of the living. How then can one still oppose natural science, the science of nature, to to what the signs of culture, of society, of man, of spirit, if there is some kind of homogeneity between these productions of the living being called man, and the functioning of genetic reproduction, the opposition between sciences of nature and other sciences loses its pertinence and its rigor. And one wonders whether biology can still claim to construct its truth, a truth of its specific field. I said at the beginning that I wanted to put into some kind of organized relation the logic of reproduction and the question of the model. This will lead us, though perhaps not today, to appeal once again to what I elsewhere call the graphics of the supplement, or the supplement. Supplement, the word supplement is not something I am imposing on Jacob. It comes up repeatedly in his book, and not by chance. To define the acquisition in the course of reproduction of new genetic programs or new programming powers, and among these And this is not by chance either. Even though chance is on the program. Our sexuality and death. In the history of genetic programs and of reproduction, sexuality and death have supervened. That is to say, they have happened. They have come to be added on unforeseeably, contrary to what we would tend to spontaneously believe. Note that Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, recalls this same fact. And we will have to read him from this point of view. In other words, we can think that the essence of the living, its reproducibility, its structure of self-production, does not necessarily imply either sexuality nor death. How do sexuality and death supervene upon it? How are these accidents, these accessories, integrated into the essence of certain living beings, that is, as internal properties? How do these supplements become essential functions? We will have to wait until next time to take on these questions. Today, in order to conclude, I simply want to note, by way of anticipation, two things. One, Jacob does indeed identify sexuality and death as supplements. Accident, superfluous auxiliaries. I like that, superfluous auxiliaries. They are unnecessary additives. I think this is becoming very interesting. So I will stop there to have a look-see at what we went to past. Let's have a look-see. We have found. That is acting up on me. Not so much an interesting code as something that is very noteworthy. And it's next to the, it's page 108, page 89. It's to the left of the 124 mark. And within the parentheses, we could see it is true that there are fewer of these in Jacob than in Monod, these latter being at once less discrete and less advanced from this point of view. And this is not part of the argument, but in some rather found of Monod, I completely agree. But he had loads more influence. He was speaking to the masses, and when he received the Nobel Prize, he was actually trumpeting this more than anyone else during the 60s. It was enormous influence. But yes, I understand why he didn't choose the more famous Monod. He is less discreet and definitely less advanced, although he beats Dawkins. So we go down a bit and we go to what begins with implication. It's about 5 lines further down. There you go, the implications. The implication here is that one, inasmuch as truth is no longer being sought. We said before, we only have reproduction leading to reproduction. There's no no real need for truth. This value has been discarded and suspicion cast upon all those who once believed that truth was this exalted thing, after which one ran or before which one bowed down. How do I explain this? Well, truth is not coming from truth itself. Think of epistemology, how you understand truth indirectly. And in the machine-like system, it's the machine that takes care of truth. So there is no longer truth with a big T. Today, we don't say an article is true because I wrote it and it contains truth. It's true because our paper reviewed. It has to follow a machine-like manner of logic thinking. It's these things that Derrida is deconstructing, and there are no exceptions to this. It wouldn't be accepted if it didn't follow this. Or you'd have to be very, very smart. There is a famous example, Ludwig Wittgenstein never followed it. But thanks to his geniality, he got away with it. Some mighty support he had. But still truth is seeping in, of course, within quotation marks, within the parenthesis, or why not in big letters, hidden just in front of our eyes. So indeed, biology in a way is still seeking truth, just hiding it. We can continue on the same thing here. While this character is acknowledged to be a simplification, what we just read with regard to essence, with regard to the history of the integron and so on, should be enough to convince us that biology still seeks the truth of life, and as life, as livingness in the reproducibility of the self. As for the formulation, it is building its own truth. This implies that truth can be appropriated, which is not new, and that it is specific in its model to each field. Now it becomes even greater. This is the sharpness of Derrida, but we have never had more reason to doubt this specificity than after reading and even approving Jacob, who insists on the necessary and integrative cooperation between biology and the other natural sciences. First of all, I would say, and I would agree with Derrida on the fact that I quote, contrary to what's often imagined, biology is not a unified field. The heterogeneity of its objects, the variety of its techniques, and the divergent interests of its practitioner all lead to a multiplication of disciplines. And of course, and I say of course, and I read of course one would be able to respond that the appeal to the physico-chemical sciences is not necessarily in contradiction with the specificity of biology. That last, I will stretch a bit and I say they all lean towards the idea of the chemical-physical stability. That's the wall everybody is putting their hands towards. Not admitting it or admitting it. Jacques Monod, I'm happy he didn't choose, but he's much more indiscreet there, clear. The physical sciences is in his case, in his ideas, in his approach, more foundational than biology. Founds everything. But it's an illusion that physics is a unified field. There is no chance to put electromagnetism, hydrodynamics, nor thermodynamics into the same system. They contradict each other. Not knowing that, you can be happy to lean to that. That reminds me of a story that a man in the jungle sometime, at some instant, tried to catch what we call in Swedish a lian. I think maybe it's in English too. Those things that you can swing from. Turned out to be a snake that bit him. But until he touched the lian, thought it to be stable and helpful. So once more we have the double take, the hiding, the marginalization. He uses truth to get rid of truth, and he takes truth to be on the side. He doesn't admit leaning towards physics in the same way as the less discrete Monod does, but he'll still do it. That's the ulterior truth. He tends towards essentialism. His argumentation definitely contains aita, telos, cause and effect. It contains life, but he calls it living. He uses life to get rid of life. So maybe some comments from my dear colleague here.
Yes, indeed. Hopefully you hear me.
Please speak very clearly into the mic.
Yes, let me very briefly return to our paper by Clark that we went through last week. I do have a point, and it's about Emperor Nero. So it was about the return of Nero. Means that you remember that Juvenal, Roman poet Juvenal, called Domitian Padre Nero. Domitian is the alter of Nero. Let me see. Let me show this. So the idea is that Domitian is the Nero born, and I will reveal what is relevant to Derrida. And here, remember, Hans, it is an ace, but it belongs to the 7. That is related. Domitian would be the ace emperor of king, and so Domitian is the Nero reborn. So that is my point here. So let us return to Derrida, and I will show you my point, which is actually the bizarre combination. But I got an idea here on page 88. Third line from down, page 88. Here. So this is my point. An absolute creation, an absolute monstrosity, does not even relate enough to itself to reproduce itself, to divide itself and resemble itself in another copy of itself. This phrase is a little bit enigmatic, and this would imply, if you would take it out of context, that Nero Nero being a beast, a monster, he cannot repeat himself.
Well, yeah.
But I don't really get what is Derrida's point here. Do you understand what is the point here? Why is this monstrosity coming? That means we can find it better. So I think that the idea itself of opening itself, that everything's reproduction is a monstrosity. Do you think that is the point of here? The rest of self of self-reproduction is now what comes to the limit of creation or the multiplied meat, at the same time the chance of reproduction.
You can think of a mule. If you cross a horse and a donkey,
okay,
you get this monstrosity. Well, it's a simplification, but it cannot reproduce itself. And mutation is a bit like a mule.
So Jacob would deny that mutations are possible.
No, they are possible, but they become, how do you say, this is very complicated, they become sort of encapsulated into the Russian doll. So the monstrosity disappears by sort of trickery, so to speak. But it's still there. Mutations is a thorn in the eye.
Okay. So at the point here.
You can say like this, at a certain level, mutation is a thorn in the eye.
What do you call foil in the eye? Foil. Okay, foil, like a magician does trickery.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me see, read this aloud. The deviation of a mutation can be reproduced and so not to remain unique and thus ephemeral only to the extent that it limits itself and conforms to certain conditions of reproduction, of reproducibility. An absolute deviation, an absolute monstrosity does not even relate enough to itself to reproduce itself, to divide itself and reproduce itself, another copy of itself. Okay, now I get it. Okay, so I agree with you.
It's not the simplest of sentences.
But let's relate to this bizarre comparison to Nero Domitian. So Domitian would be the reborn. Nero is a monstrosity that you have to, so to say, hide. Of course.
Yes.
But it's still there, even though you try to hide it.
Yes, this is frightfully complicated. I skipped it because it's so complicated. But very good, yeah.
It's like calling a dictator today a bald-headed Hitler or something like that. It's a monstrosity. It works. It's still there.
Yeah.
Or you can call Putin Hitler without mustache.
Oh yeah.
It's still there. Okay, let me leave this. If we have time, I do have some comments here. How is we the time? It's a little bit long, but it's about your comment about biology being its own field. And we have in the past, we had discussed the quantum biology with Iranian British broadcaster. What was his name again? Quantum biology. Quantum biology would show that fields are unified because quantum goes into biology and vice versa.
Oh yeah.
So this is, so to say, the last. Let me see. Quantum biology. Don't you agree that fields are unified? So you cannot separate. You spoke earlier about thermodynamics, but even thermodynamics enters into is everything is related, or do you disagree?
Come again, Kalle, you were breaking up.
Everything is related.
Slowly, please, slowly.
Everything is related, even thermodynamics.
Yeah, yes, maybe, yeah, sure.
But you don't completely agree, perhaps.
Well, it's related, yeah, but it doesn't. It's in contradistinction to hydrodynamics and electromagnetism and many other fields. The idea of a unified chemical-physical science is. Oh yeah, yeah, indeed, very good.
Yes, this was what was the name? I cannot remember. His name is so difficult. The broadcaster who made a
Robin. Oh, Jim Al-Khalili.
Jim Al-Khalili. Why does he have to have such a complicated name? Let me see if they mention his book in the biography.
But it's one could say that if I just make a short summary, because I think we have to end here.
Yes.
Run over the time. But what you showed here, Kalle, is that yes, all the biology, Jacob, Monod, Kangelheim is being replaced, but it's still very interesting, these texts, because in all other fields of knowledge, the biology still have an influence, 100% influence. And that will not be affected, that it sort of changes as a science. Now the machinery is in place, and the thinking logic that we are using is biology today. It is evolution, it's DNA. So that will hinder these discoveries of quantum biology to enter. We can repeat them for namesake, but it won't enter. Which I think makes it even more interesting. I'll end there. We went a little bit past today. I say thank you very much for participating, Kalle. Thank you for listening, everyone. And have a pleasant afternoon or day or night or whatever you have. Bye-bye for now.